Good morning. Sajid Javid starts work as Health Secretary this morning following the resignation of Matt Hancock. Mr. Javid's top priority will be beating the COVID-19 pandemic as the number of cases continues to rise. In his resignation letter, Mr. Hancock apologised again for breaking rules on social distancing that he had asked others to follow, and to his family for what he had put them through. Our political editor Beth Rigby reports.
This now the moment when the personal proved politically fateful for Matt Hancock. The Health Secretary resigning over pictures of him breaking his own social distancing guidance and possibly the law. But his relationship with old friend and political aide Gina Coladangelo raising far more than personal scandal. Criticism too over his decision to put her on the public payroll. Miss Coladangelo left her post on the board at the Department of Health as Mr. Hancock realised he too had to go.
Those of us who make these rules have got to stick by them, and that's why I've got to resign. I want to thank people for their incredible sacrifices and what they've done. Everybody working in the NHS, across social care, everyone involved in the vaccine programme, and frankly, everybody in this country who has risen to the challenges that we've seen over this past 18 months. I'm very proud of what we've done to protect the NHS at the peak, to deliver that vaccine rollout, one of the fastest in the world, and I look forward to supporting the government and the Prime Minister from the backbenches to make sure that we can get out of this pandemic. We're so close to the end.
Are you hopeless, Mr. Hancock? I don't think so. Is it your chance to give the version of events today, Mr. Hancock?
Mr. Hancock had become used to defending himself in recent weeks. Embarrassing leaked text messages from the PM described him as hopeless. Former aide Dominic Cummings told MPs Mr. Hancock was incompetent, a liar, unfit for high office. But then, little option but to hand in his resignation letter to the Prime Minister, who in turn said he was sorry to receive it. But many colleagues thought Mr. Hancock had no option.
It's OK having the support and the confidence of the Prime Minister, but in a pandemic, you've also got to have the support and the confidence of the public. And although I think they had some sympathy with him over the affair, it wasn't that. It was the perceived hypocrisy of telling people to do one thing and doing another yourself.
The Labour leader also glad he's gone, but thinks the PM should have pushed him.
I think this reveals the weakness, lack of judgment, lack of leadership from Boris Johnson, that he didn't sack him. And if Number 10 are briefing this was Matt Hancock's decision, not Boris Johnson, I think that tells you even more so that Boris Johnson isn't cut out for the demands of leadership.
But with the vaccine rollout still underway, he does need an experienced leader in such a demanding department, appointing former Chancellor Sajid Javid as the new Health Secretary. The pair last worked together before the pandemic hit, Mr. Javid returning to the Cabinet in very different circumstances. One old friend and political ally confident.
He's only just taken the appointment from the Prime Minister, but he knows how to run organisations, he's run businesses, he's been Secretary of State in a number of departments, as well as being the former Chancellor. I think that he'll give the NHS an important focus. It's a huge organisation, a huge employer. He has compassion, he believes in public service, he believes in the public sector. I think this is a very good and inspired appointment from the Prime Minister.
This government and its former Health Secretary will have many questions to answer when that inquiry begins. But for now, the man that has led on public health for 15 months, brought down not by his political record, but his personal life. Beth Rigby, Sky News.
Well, Sajid Javid has a huge task ahead of him, helping the NHS through the pandemic. The overwhelming focus on the coronavirus means that more than 5 million people are now on waiting lists. As Ivor Bennett now reports.
On the embankment wall facing Parliament, there is a heart for every single coronavirus victim in Britain. And for those who have a loved one represented here, this scandal has been particularly hard to fathom. Fran Hall is part of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. She lost her husband Steve in the pandemic last year.
The country as a whole, we've done what we've been asked to do. So to find out that it doesn't apply, this rule of keeping your distance and not interacting with other households to people in charge, it's so disappointing. And it's so worrying as well, because all moral authority has gone.
Regaining that moral authority will clearly not be easy, though. That much evident at an anti-lockdown protest in central London just hours before Matt Hancock's resignation. But Sajid Javid faces several other challenges too. 15 months into the pandemic, NHS staff are at breaking point, not just from their physical toil, but at what they see as a lack of recognition. Unions are still demanding the government increase its recommended 1% pay rise to prevent staff leaving. Then there's the backlog of patients, more than 5 million on the formal waiting list for treatment, and an estimated 7 million more who have stayed away from hospital during the pandemic. The pressures are unprecedented.
So his first task really is to restore some calm. He needs to give the reassurance that he's fully informed about the position we're in. He knows the science, he knows where we are, and that he needs to ensure that he asks for trust and that he's going to offer that back to the public.
Even for an experienced pair of ministerial hands, it is not an easy task. The government's lockdown mantra of togetherness in danger of falling apart. Ivor Bennett, Sky News.
Well, the resignation of Matt Hancock after he admitted breaking the coronavirus restrictions on the front pages of all the papers, and obviously we're going to be covering it all day here. Joining me now is Peter Cardwell, who's a former special advisor in both Boris Johnson and Theresa May's governments. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. So we finally reached the threshold for ministerial resignation in this government.
Yes, I think it was right that Matt Hancock resigned. He made that decision, and I think it was right that he went. Obviously, he made a huge mistake. There's a breach of trust there in terms of him breaking those social distancing regulations. I don't think people are too concerned necessarily with who he was doing it with, although obviously that is desperately sad for both him and his family and those affected.
You say it's right that he's gone, but do you think the amount of time that it took was right? We saw him come out, apologise, say, yes, I've broken the guidelines. We saw the PM say the matter's closed. And then, 36, 48 hours later, he resigns. Shouldn't he have just done it straight away?
I think sometimes in politics it takes a little while for things to set in. Of course, the public reaction wasn't really known, but it was inevitable that this was going to happen. I think it's very sad that it has happened. I think Matt Hancock, despite huge challenges, and I'm not going to say for a second that he did everything right as Health Secretary. Of course, mistakes were made, but he certainly was someone who I've known for 11 years. He had a very stellar ministerial career, and that position of Health Secretary was not an easy one at any stage, but certainly not when the pandemic hit. I think in terms of the timing of his resignation, there are questions to be asked about whether Boris Johnson should have sacked him previously. But of course, as time went on, it became untenable. It became very, very clear that he had to resign.
What do you make of Labour's calls this morning, last night, that he should have been sacked?
Well, I think you can look over the last 48 hours, 36, 48 hours and say things should have happened at certain times. The fact is Matt Hancock has resigned. I think Labour have failed at various points to provide an alternative to this government. I think they are weak, and I think that they're attacking the government when it is in trouble. And that's perfectly fine. That's what an opposition should be doing. But the fact is that the chronology of this isn't going to concern the public too much. I think the fact Matt Hancock is gone is what people will know, and that they will realise that Sajid Javid is now the new Health Secretary, and he has a huge job ahead of him, and a job I think he'll do very, very well. He's someone who's very experienced within government. Of course, he's been the Chancellor, he's been the Home Secretary, he's been the Housing Secretary, he's been the Culture Secretary. And from day one, he may not know every single thing about the health service, but of course he will know the mechanics of government. He knows how to lead, and he knows that there is a huge job to be done in a pandemic. And I think perhaps some of the reluctance of Boris Johnson to sack Matt Hancock was perhaps to do with the fact that that job is so big. it's probably the most important job in the cabinet at the moment, and Sajid Javid is the right man for the job.
We'll get to Sajid Javid in a moment, but you say that the public will know that Matt Hancock resigned. They'll also know that Boris Johnson didn't sack him. Does that mean that Boris Johnson doesn't think it's serious enough that he broke those guidelines?
I think it's a bit strange that Boris Johnson said, this is now over, essentially. We've seen previously that Neil Ferguson, for example, from SAGE, we've seen the Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, those two had apparently broken lockdown restrictions, had broken the guidance that certainly they were involved in setting, and both of them went. So I think it would have been pretty clear that Matt Hancock's position was untenable. The Prime Minister, for whatever reason, decided not to sack Matt Hancock, and of course, Matt Hancock fell on the sword. But as I said, the chronology of all of this, I think, won't be remembered necessarily. The Prime Minister, of course, was probably reluctant to have sacked his Health Secretary during this pandemic, wanting a bit of continuity of leadership during such a difficult time for the public and in terms of public health. But I think it became inevitable. Matt Hancock did the right thing.
OK, Sajid Javid, he's been brought in. You say he's the best man for the job, but he had a huge row with Boris Johnson 16 months ago. So huge, in fact, that he resigned as Chancellor 4 weeks before the budget.
Yes, that's right. And that was a pretty unedifying affair. The involvement, of course, of Dominic Cummings cannot be forgotten in all of that. Dominic Cummings was insistent that Mr. Javid's whole team, his team of special advisors, people who did the job that I did, were to be sacked. And of course, Mr. Javid decided to be loyal to his special advisors and decided to go, which was an absolutely dramatic thing to happen, which involved Rishi Sunak becoming the Chancellor. And of course, I think there's a bit of unfinished business there. I think Mr. Johnson probably feels a bit guilty about that affair. Sajid Javid probably shouldn't have gone at that point, although Rishi Sunak has made an outstanding Chancellor. And I think that there is perhaps, because of that unfinished business, he feels that Sajid Javid should come back. Of course, what all could have happened, I suppose, is that Mr. Johnson could have promoted someone from within, another minister, but then you create a sort of domino effect that one role has to be filled in, has to be filled in, has to be filled in. So bringing back a backbencher and someone who has actually been very loyal to this government, despite the fact he was treated pretty shabbily, is now the Health Secretary, and that is someone who can hit the ground running. Sajid Javid, tomorrow morning, he'll be in the Department of Health and he'll be making all the decisions that affect our lives and will hopefully get us our freedoms back on the 19th of July.
OK, Peter, thank you so much for talking to us. Well, also this morning, 156 people are still missing after an apartment block collapsed in Florida. One body has been found overnight, and it's now been revealed that 3 years ago, engineers warned about serious faults in the construction of the building. Martha Kellner reports from Florida.
Acrid smoke hangs heavy in the air across Surfside, a constant reminder of the tragedy still unfolding here. Fires burn deep in the wreckage, still smouldering despite the storm. Judy Spiegel was in the building. Her husband, Kevin, who was away on business, knows this unthinkable purgatory won't be over anytime soon.
I do cry on and off, and try to comfort the kids and the grandkids is really my focus.
Do your grandkids know, or?
Well, yeah, we told Scarlett that Grandma's lost and we can't find her. She knows something's up. She doesn't know why, but Grandma was always there to take care of her, and that she's not there. She's very concerned.
Every day here brings fresh heartbreak for the families of the 5 dead and 156 people still missing. This time it was news of a report which found major structural damage in the vicinity of the building and crumbling of columns in the parking garage beneath. That was 3 years ago. When the building came down in the early hours of Thursday morning, repairs still hadn't started. The Champlain Towers North is almost identical to the Champlain Towers South, which collapsed. It was built at the same time with the same design, yet residents here still haven't been evacuated. They want reassurances from Florida's governor that they're not in danger too. Would you feel safe going to sleep tonight if you were in the sister building of this, just 100 yards away?
I know they are considering potentially evacuating them, but that's something that ultimately the mayor's going to have to make the call on.
You've got all your clothes in there.
Yeah. And that's it. Few dollars here, and that's it.
William has moved out of his own accord with all his belongings in one plastic bag.
I'm very, very worried. I am 75 years old in my living every day with the threat that the building could be collapsed.
The apartment block was built on reclaimed wetlands, like many in this area. A study had found it was sinking into the ground at a rate of 2 millimetres a year.
In the 1990s, what we found was that the land was subsiding, was lowering down in several places. When we see only one building that is moving, we cannot say exactly why.
So with the Champlain Towers South, it was very localised. It was just that building that was subsiding at that point.
That's right.
It could be months, perhaps even years, before families discover what exactly caused the building to collapse, devastating lives and changing this beach town forever. Now authorities are under pressure to ensure it can never happen again. Martha Kellner, Sky News, Florida.
Official figures suggest that by the end of today, half of all under 30s will have received their first dose of a coronavirus vaccine. Let's speak to our correspondent, Shaman Freeman-Powell. Morning, Shaman. So young people continuing to take up the offer of a vaccine.
Yes, they have been, and the government are describing this as a real milestone moment. It now means that more than 60% of adults in the UK have had their first vaccine. More than 4 in 5 adults in the UK have had their first vaccine, with more than 60% now having had both doses. And the NHS are also really pleased with this turnout as well. They say that it proves that young people do understand the importance of being protected against the virus, and said that it's been particularly good in those areas of low take-up. I've actually been travelling around some of these centres in London and have come across people that were at first hesitant about getting their vaccine, however had seen these walk-in centres and decided to go along and take it up. So the government are hoping that this continues and that more of those over the age of 18 will continue to use these centres today, ahead of that crucial July the 19th date, which most of the restrictions will be lifted, and so more people will be protected with these vaccinations.
Shaman, thank you. Right, time for the weather now. Here's Naz.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. It's looking pretty wet, to say the least, across southern areas of the UK for today, tonight, tomorrow, even into the day after. But elsewhere, it's looking mostly fine. Thanks to high pressure, we're going to see largely dry and sunny conditions into this afternoon. Quite a cloudy start around northern and eastern parts, though, with some drizzle, and cloudy across the south, where we are seeing spells of rain already across many central southwestern areas in particular, but also some showery rain towards the southeast. And the rain will continue across these areas into this afternoon. There will be some heavy downpours likely at times, especially down towards southwestern areas, but later towards the southeast as well. And it may spread up a little further northwards towards southern parts of Wales, central England, towards areas of Suffolk as well. Elsewhere, though, there will be bright or sunny spells developing. It will be a mainly dry afternoon, and it will feel pleasantly warm in any sunshine, particularly across northwestern parts. Although for the northwest of Scotland, there is a weak front there, bringing cloudy skies, some patchy light rain and drizzle too.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Sajid Javid starts work today as Health Secretary. He replaces Matt Hancock, who resigned last night after admitting breaking coronavirus rules. Let's speak to our political correspondent now, Rob Powell, who joins us from Westminster. Good morning, Rob. So, Sajid Javid back in Cabinet, but this time around with possibly the most difficult job in government.
Yeah, exactly, Kimberly. And I think given that context and the scale of the task in that department, it perhaps wasn't a surprise that Boris Johnson reached for someone like Sajid Javid to fill that space, someone that has got extensive cabinet experience, but crucially someone as well who's not in the cabinet at the moment. And so there would be no need for a wider reshuffle of his top team. As you say, a daunting task ahead. I think even without the pandemic, there's a raft of NHS reforms on the table, as well as that long-promised social care reform that Boris Johnson has spoken about for the last 2 years, but as yet has not delivered. I think the most immediate thing on his in tray, though, and the most immediate decisions he will have to play a part in is around the coronavirus restrictions. July the 19th is still the day where the country is due to have all legal restrictions lifted. Sajid Javid, during his time on the backbenches, was someone that didn't vote against the government on COVID lockdowns and restrictions. He's someone that said that he thinks they got the balance about right between protecting public health and protecting the economy. But it should be said, on paper, he does come from a sort of more libertarian viewpoint and politics than Matt Hancock did. And on that, I mean that he may well have more appreciation, if you like, of the rights of the individual. And also, you're talking about a former Chancellor, someone that has worked in business, in private enterprise as well, who is also close and friends with the current Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. So whether that tips the balance within Cabinet from a position to a more sceptical position on restrictions when those arguments rear their head again, potentially in the winter, will be interesting to see.
It will. Rob, thank you so much. Well, the beginning of the end for Matt Hancock came with the publication of his embrace with Gina Coladangelo by The Sun newspaper on Friday. Joining me now is the political editor of The Sun on Sunday, David Wooding. David, good morning to you. Thanks a lot for talking to us. Just having a look at your front page this morning, it's interesting, isn't it? What do you make of the fact that despite all the PPE shortage issues, the care home issues, it was this that cut through?
Yes, people are prepared to take ministers making mistakes. We all make mistakes. What they're not happy to put up with is hypocrisy. And Matt Hancock was telling the rest of us, dictating to us how we lived our lives during this pandemic. Some felt he was overzealous. Even within the ranks of his own government, some ministers felt he was a little bit over the top in the restrictions he wanted to impose. He was regarded as, you know, one of the hawks of lockdown. And then to be found breaking the rules himself, no matter how small the rule break is, he just had to go.
Did you think going into this on Friday that we would be here on Sunday and he would have already quit by now?
Well, he was determined to brazen it out, and we were told as late as yesterday morning when I rang number 10, I was convinced he would have been gone by the weekend because the pressure was mounting. Number 10 said, no, he's not going. There's nothing here. It's all finished. We're not discussing it any further. I was still convinced he would have gone by the end of yesterday. And then there was massive silence from MPs. Nobody was rowing in to defend him in any rank whatsoever. And then suddenly we got radio silence from all quarters, and I just knew it was going to happen. And then the announcement came.
Did you think he was going to be sacked, or do you think he was going to resign?
Well, this is another issue people are discussing because of Boris Johnson's own rather colourful private life. There is a feeling in Westminster that he is loath to sack people. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. I think Boris Johnson himself doesn't like dispensing with people's services. And he does find it hard to remove people who aren't doing their job properly, I'm afraid. However, in this instance, it was Matt Hancock who saw the writing on the wall and decided it was time to fall on his sword, and rightly so too.
Do you think that the reaction on Friday just reinforced that narrative of them and us?
Yes, that has been an issue throughout. A number of issues where we've always said, is it one rule for you and one rule for everybody else? I mean, even the scientists remember Professor Lockdown, as we called him, who was one of the most zealous of the scientists, telling us how we had to live our lives. And he was doing something similar to Matt Hancock. And it then became irresistible for everybody to pile in on Matt Hancock because he too was breaking the rules. You can't preach to us how we live our lives. And don't forget, people have not been able to pay their respects properly to loved ones at funerals. Weddings have been restricted. Even myself, I wasn't able to see my own two children who were grown up over Christmas last year. And I think people felt rather bitter to see the video footage of Matt Hancock living his life differently from the rest of us.
More broadly, David, what do you think it says about the state of play of the government that you've got people leaking CCTV images like this?
Well, this has happened from time immemorial. I don't think it's anything to do with this government in particular. We have whistleblowers, thankfully, in life. Now, I know the laws have been changed to try and make it increasingly difficult to people to speak out when something goes wrong in public service. But it's right that they do, because these people are elected by us to protect our lives, protect our country, and look after us and tell us how we live our lives. And it's only right that when they fall short, that they should be exposed, and more power to the whistleblowers, I say.
OK, David, thank you so much for talking to us. Now, the theft of a dog can be devastating. Under current laws, pets are considered property. So if they're stolen, it's considered the same as the theft of a bike or a TV. But now there are calls for much tougher sentences, as Milena Veselinovic reports.
For 7 years, Gerald McCarthy's dog Molly helped him cope with the sudden death of his wife. But in February, Molly was snatched from his garden in broad daylight. And Gerald says that losing her companionship was a huge blow.
She was part of my life, big part of my life, massive part of my life. You know, the first thing when I finished work every day was just, you know, you wanted to get home for Molly. And my day, all my days were just revolved around, you know, looking after Molly, and that's what they are. They're part of your life.
Bit like family?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, she was my little girl.
But legally, pets are classed as property. So when they're taken, it's no different to a stolen bike. And for Katie Stickley, whose dog Trigger was returned by the police 8 months after he was stolen, this doesn't reflect the emotional bond between pets and their owners.
It should be classed as kidnapped because it's a living person. Even though it's not a human, it's still living and it's still part of the family. I felt sick, like that someone's actually done that. Felt like shaky and helpless that you can't do nothing. Like it was like if one of your children was to get stolen.
On Monday, Parliament will debate proposals that could make it easier for stolen pets to be reunited with their rightful owners, like making microchip scanning compulsory for vets. But many want the government to go further, and a petition to make dog theft a specific offence with a minimum 2-year sentence has got more than 500,000 signatures.
The current legislation isn't tough enough. People can steal a pet and they might get a fine, maybe £120, something like that, rather than face the full force of the law. And that's because it doesn't take into consideration, the traumatic effect it has on the family. So what we want to do is have the law recognise the trauma that's caused in a family by having a pet stolen, and an appropriate sentence in that situation.
Gerald now has a new dog, but says that nothing can replace Molly. He and many others want robust punishment for those who steal beloved pets. Milena Veselinovic, Sky News.
Time for the weather. It's Naz.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. Rather wet one for the next couple of days across southern parts of the UK. There'll be rain on and off and some heavy downpours at times as well. Elsewhere, though, looking fine. Lots of sunshine expected into this afternoon. A bit of a cloudy start this morning around northern and eastern parts where there's some drizzle, but it is brighter further west, and we'll see skies brighten up for many areas into this afternoon. North Sea facing coastal areas and may stay quite cool and cloudy for much of the day. And it stays cloudy across many southern counties of England as well, particularly for central, south and western parts, where there will be spells of rain this morning, continuing into this afternoon, and then returning in towards southeastern areas where you can see some rather intense downpours are likely, and they may spread up to southern parts of Wales, central England towards Suffolk as well. Norfolk perhaps just about getting away with some sunshine there. And in fact, it looks fine and sunny elsewhere across the UK and Ireland for this afternoon. Mainly dry, feeling warm, particularly across northwestern areas where the highest temperatures are likely.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Hello again, time for another look at the papers. And with us this morning to take us through, Nikki Hodgson and Marianne Ohotta. Nikki, Marianne, thanks a lot for joining us this morning. Obviously, Matt Hancock on the front of all of the pages with his resignation. Marianne, you've chosen the Times for us to go through. What's their take on it?
So left-hand side, it's all about end of marriage, having to resign. Focus on instead on the columns on the right-hand side. This story about the private email account that hid COVID business from officials. Now, those of us who've been around the sun quite a few times may well have wondered, well, hang on a minute, if those photos that, you know, would probably prompt Hancock's resignation, if they were taken in May, why is it taken until the end of June for them to be published? And the question is, what are we trying to perhaps deflect attention from? What is the kind of the reason for the timing now? And one of the answers may well be that there's an awful lot of other kinds of speculation going on at the moment, and accusations, and a growing body of evidence that shows that perhaps these kind of questions about, you know, dodgy dealings with the PPE contracts, certain contractors who had no background in supplying pharmaceuticals or protective equipment to the NHS suddenly getting multi-million pound contracts. You know, there's kind of these middle men operators who got massive backhands on the basis of kind of commission, basically on the basis of securing these deals. And they just so happen to, you know, be pals with ministers or have very significant connections. And this particular story is about some minutes of a meeting that was held between senior officials at the Department of Health and Social Care that has been leaked to the Times, saying that civil servants basically know that Matt Hancock was operating a private personal account, which he used as a means of communicating not only with members of his office, but also other contractors and other cabinet members to discuss, amongst other things like PPE contracts, as well as other aspects of not only COVID pandemic, but other elements of his official business. Now, this breaches the rules of the ways that ministers ought to kind of operate their working business. It should all be through government accounts, because then there's a clear record of it, there's scrutiny. It's not necessarily all going to be released to the public, but there's scrutiny within the kind of the mechanisms of power. And Matt Hancock hasn't been doing that at least since March 2020. And this meeting was held in December 2020. This weekend also, the Good Law Project is...
We're going to have to leave it there, Marianne, because we're running out of time. We need to move on.
Oh, sorry. Anyway,
That's all right.
Big questions.
Yeah.
Big questions and really need answering. So let's not take our eye off the ball, because this is the real story, I think.
Yeah, we'll see how that develops. Sticking with the COVID theme and the leaked email theme, Nikki, The Express, page 6 and 7, a cancer avalanche. What's this about?
Yeah, so this was always something that was going to be, it was predicted by many a medic at the beginning of the pandemic, that as a result of the restrictions in terms of treatment, the overflow of beds needed for COVID patients, those that had cancer were not going to receive treatment on time. And this is saying that, this is from a leaked email, again from a London hospital, and it's saying that a record 230,000 patients have been sent for checks since March this year, and that's as a direct result of the pandemic. And so, as we say, this was predicted long ago by medics, the NHS was completely overwhelmed anyway, and then was going to be overwhelmed. So, it's been a terrible year to be in the medical profession. But what the advisors in this piece make very clear is that it's important to say that if the politicians say that the NHS is coping very well, if Boris Johnson now says, we're doing very well because, we've got more beds back and look how brilliantly everything is going, that's effectively a lie. And Professor Carol Sikora, who was quoted in this piece, actually says it is dishonest to say that the NHS is coping very well at the moment because of so many of these cancer patients, many of whom are in their 20s and 30s.
That's also interesting. Going to see how that pans out. The pressure on the NHS, you wouldn't want to be the health secretary, would you? Marianne, the Telegraph page 2. This is interesting because we're always told that we're all going to have to be vegetarian if we want to hit the climate targets, aren't we?
Well, yeah, this is a conversation that we're all going to have a lot over the next few years, I think. The UK have a legally mandated target of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And some of the easy gains have been made, things like increasing renewable energy. So, all those offshore wind farms, things like that, replacing some of the coal-fired power stations. But in the next 10 years or so, and then going forwards, a lot of the changes that we're going to have to make in terms of tackling climate change, keeping global net warming to below 1.5 degrees centigrade, is going to be about consumer choices. That's not just what car you're going to drive, what transport you choose to make. It's also going to be things like what we eat. And George Eustice, the Environment Secretary, has come out saying, well, we've got government advisors saying that we're all going to have to cut our meat by about 1/5. That's not loads, let's be honest. It's not all becoming, vegan or anything like that. We're going to have to cut our meat by about 1/5 meat consumption and choose higher value, higher welfare, possibly a little bit more expensive, but it's okay because you're eating less. So overall, it might be cost neutral for most people. And George Eustice is saying, well, hang on a minute, we don't want to lecture to people because that puts them off. The thing is, though, we're all in this together, and the implications of us not doing enough are catastrophic for our future generations. So it's not so much that we can all blithely carry on, eating our cheap burgers and stocking up the barbecue with no consequences. There are very real consequences. It's your house getting flooded. There's wildfires. It's a lack of food for millions of people elsewhere in the world. And the big question is, how do we actually tackle this responsibly and help people, all of us, make positive decisions that are good for the climate, also good for our bodies and our health, in a way that the government can support? And it sort of comes off the back of, the government are touting around the world looking for free trade deals to compensate for Brexit.